The path to mastery leads through the heart of adversity. Challenge is the raw material from which courage and strength are forged. Warriors are not defined by events. Warriors define them. Warriors conquer themselves before all else. Warriors are relentless in their service to others. Join us as we open our hearts and hone our minds to a razor's edge. It doesn't matter how slow you go, only that you do not stop. Your time is now. And now your host, Jason McKenzie.
You know, I feel like I need to start this podcast by something other than saying, I love this conversation. But you know what? Fuck it. I love this conversation. I love this one, especially, is that proper grammar? Probably not. I especially love this conversation. And the reason is because it gave me a really interesting insight into seeing how a lot of the same principles that we are applying in our mastermind groups, helping men around the world develop, self-awareness, self-mastery, and selflessly serving others, is being applied in amazingly different contexts that are related to mental health and post-traumatic stress. So this conversation is with Ken Falke, and he is just a really amazing guy. He was in explosive ordnance disposal in the military for a long time, so think like Hurt Locker. And he's a super successful entrepreneur, and he's a man of dedicated, just selfless service to other people. It's amazing. And what he is doing is, through his own experience and seeing people with post-traumatic stress, he has become a passionate practitioner, I guess you could say, in teaching people how to achieve post-traumatic growth. And what that really means is not just like bouncing back, but bouncing higher. Like, he uses a Super Bowl analogy. And it's really cool because as we talk about in the podcast, we talk about all kinds of cool stuff. Like, first of all, we get some specifics and some inside baseball, say, on explosive ordnance disposal, which I was always wondering. Well, it's not that I was always wondering about it, but once we started talking, I got curious about it. And we talk about a lot of powerful tools that really can apply in all areas of your life, but he is applying to the area of post-traumatic growth. And he really uses a really good analogy of, instead of looking in the rearview mirror, about being present and using the focus on living in the present to help you craft a different future. And that's exactly what I believe too. So it was really neat to talk about that. But Ken is a very knowledgeable guy, and he's doing amazing work helping people. And we talk about, it's a wide-ranging conversation to sort of how things are in the military now, how he came to look for another way, another path forward, and in helping people with post-traumatic stress. And he's really done some amazing work. We talk about everything from meditation to human connection to all kinds of different therapies and how they're being combined at his in his programs. And it's really a powerful conversation. And I think, excuse me, the scope of the conversation, when you think about it, those foundations, they apply to every single person. Every single person pretty much needs human connection. Every single person needs to focus on learning how to own the stories that we are telling ourselves, how to develop self-awareness, how to be present, how to connect with, did I say connect with people? I think I did. But all of this stuff I talk about all the time, Ken is actually, applying this work in a very different context to what I've done. And I absolutely loved the conversation, and I love what Ken is doing. So he's the CEO and founder of Boulder Crest, which is the nation's first privately funded 501c mental health center dedicated to veterans. He's the author of an upcoming book called Struggle Well, which I just love that title, right? Because isn't that really what we're trying to do here? Life can be a struggle sometimes, whether you're dealing with post-traumatic stress or not. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to embrace a struggle and do it really well, because that's how we grow, whatever the struggle happens to be. That book is coming out on May 1st, 2018. And with his book and the organization, he's unveiling mental health strategies used for veterans and post-war trauma and using them to help others. I mean, there's the scope of what what he's doing has a scope even broader than what he's doing right now. We talk about that a little bit at the end of the podcast, but he's a great guy, and it was a really, really enjoyable conversation for me. I'm sure you can tell by the sound of my voice. And that's why I love doing this podcast so much, is because we recorded this at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, and I'm looking at the clock, and it's 1:53 in the afternoon, and I'm literally still pumped up from the conversation, because meaning is made in conversation, right? When you have these types of conversations with people, you get this crazy new insights, and you get enthusiastic, and you get, it's like new connections, new relationships, right? And so I'm walking around on a high, and I'm like thinking to myself, just if you want to have more of these conversations, start a podcast. It's amazing. I know I'm probably screaming into the microphone right now, but I just got back from a really long unicycle ride, and I'm also on a high from that. So I'll probably stop rambling right about now. Well, not quite yet. And just say, listen to the podcast. And if you are dealing with post-traumatic stress yourself, know someone or love someone who's dealing with post-traumatic stress, listen to this episode and take it in, because there's so much in here. There's so much in here to help you move away from the past, really, and to help you intentionally move away from the past and move towards a future that you want to create, because you don't have to drag around this boat anchor for your whole life. There is a future, and maybe there's a future that you want to create. And that's a powerful thing to think about, especially for people that have never really done that and don't believe it's possible. So enjoy the podcast, and we'll see you on the other side. And thank you again, Ken. Hey, Ken, welcome to the Mental Health Warriors podcast.
Hey, good morning. How are you? Everything is good on my end. Jason, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, welcome. I'm doing great. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because the idea of post-traumatic growth is a subject that I am really, really interested in. And I think one of the reasons I'm interested in it is because with my own experience and dealing with first responders and seeing, a lot of people with post-traumatic stress, I'm really curious about the growth that can happen afterwards, because I've seen that in my own life with some of the trauma that I've experienced. But on the flip side of that, I often find myself wondering, with some of the people who are sort of really into the world of helping people with post-traumatic stress, sometimes I wonder if they're doing themselves a service, because I feel like they're so wrapped up in this world of reliving their trauma constantly. And I find myself wondering if it's serving them over the long term. So I'm hoping we can unpack some of that stuff throughout the conversation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I watched a documentary recently on veterans doing prolonged exposure, and these guys were recording their the most horrific things that they had been through. And then they were putting these tapes like in their cars and driving their cars. I guess they weren't tapes, but whatever the files were, but and driving in their cars. And I'm thinking, this is malpractice. These guys are on a highway. I mean, it's got to be as bad listening to your own trauma while you're driving a vehicle as it is, drinking and driving.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Okay. So I guess maybe my first question is, why is this topic of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth so important to you?
Well, let me, if I can, I'll give you a kind of a quick background. So I spent 21 years in the Navy as a bomb disposal guy. I'm not a mental health expert by any means, although I feel, I don't like that word expert anyway, but I do feel like I've gained a lot of wisdom over the last probably 10 or 12 years that I've been doing what I'm doing. Early in the war, back in 2004, my wife and I were here in D.C. I'd retired from the Navy when the first bomb disposal troop had lost his legs in Iraq. And we started a small foundation back then called the Wounded EOD Warrior Foundation. And EOD is Explosive Ordnance Disposal. And probably from 2004 to 2000 and probably 13-ish, I sat by the hospital beds of probably 200 guys and gals who had been severely wounded. And I say severely physically wounded in the ways of amputations, blind, burned, paralysis, those severe physical injuries that happen, in war. And in training, by the way, we had a couple guys that were severely wounded, getting trained up to go over to Iraq and Afghanistan. And in that foundation today is called the EOD Warrior Foundation. We merged it with an older legacy foundation that did scholarships for children. Which we still do. So through that work, we held a caregiver retreat out at this place. So my wife and I, in 2012, started bringing these families out to our home from the hospitals here in DC, and ended up donating 37 acres of land and built the nation's first, had a dedicated facility to healing the wounds of war, which we thought initially would mostly be these physically wounded guys coming out here. And early on, after opening the retreat, we hosted a caregiver retreat, which were mostly at the time young wives of guys who had been severely wounded. And I saw this one girl. It was a weekend retreat, like a Friday through Sunday, sitting in the music room at our lodge. And I went over and sat with her. And I said, "How's the weekend going?" And she said, "It's an amazing place. You've done a great job building this." She goes, "But I really wish my husband would have lost his legs." And I said, "Holy cow! Why would you say something like that?" And she said, "Because all these other ladies know what's wrong with their husband, and nobody knows what's wrong with mine." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with him?" And she said, "He's got PTSD." And truthfully, Jason, that's what started it for me.
And at that time, what was your understanding of PTSD? Because I know, obviously in recent years, it's come much more to the forefront and it's becoming much more well understood.
Yeah. So I didn't know much. I grew up, during the Vietnam War, and I grew up with a lot of my childhood mentors, scoutmasters, school teachers who were, World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam War vets. And many of my best friends in school and high school, I lived in a very military community just outside of Washington, D.C. And many of my best friends in high school's dads were, Vietnam vets who were coming back and forth. So I knew, and I delivered the newspaper, the Washington Post, the Washington Star back then. And I had read articles of these, invisible injuries and, battle fatigue and, all the things that were happening. And I didn't know much. But I went on a lesson. The day after that incident I just described in the music room, my wife and I had just happened to go 40 minutes north of here is Frederick, Maryland, to have lunch one day. And in Frederick, Maryland, there's this museum called the Civil War Museum of Military Medicine. And in the front window of this museum, this is the day after this happens, is a book called PTSD from the Civil War to Vietnam. And I bought a couple of copies actually, but I bought one for myself to read. And I read this book, and I said, I've been in combat and I've been through a lot myself, and I'm thinking, well, this is something I think we can work with, and that's kind of how I started to get educated on the process, was just simply by reading that book.
So this is I'm going to ask probably a little bit of an unrelated question, but it's just for my own curiosity. So my only exposure to obviously explosive ordnance disposals by watching The Hurt Locker. So, I mean, one thing I'm curious about is how many, you go through all this training and you go through, there's all these techniques, and I would assume there are a finite amount of ways of building a bomb. So where are the variables that come in that cause things to go wrong? You know what I mean?
In the ways of the bombs?
Yeah, like when things go wrong, what are some of the reasons that they go so terribly wrong?
For the bomb disposal person, you mean?
Yeah.
So, I always tell people that the building of bombs is really left up to the imagination of terrorists. I think what you're saying is right, that there is probably a very finite method of how bombs work. We as bomb disposal personnel categorize them into three kind of firing devices: victim operated, meaning if you step on it or open a drawer or open a book, the things you see on TV, that they go off. Command controlled, which is really what we saw a lot of in Iraq, which could be something as simple as a wire going back to a guy standing on a hill waiting for a convoy to come by, to a cell phone, to a more sophisticated, radio controlled device. And then timed, as you would think in the old days, the time bomb, and that's putting a clock in a package. It just basically is set and ticks down. And as you can imagine, with digital technology nowadays, time bombs could be set for years to be ahead. And, probably the most famous one was attack on Margaret Thatcher in south of England years ago, back in the 80s. And they had put a bomb that was set to go off 30 days later when they knew she was going to be in this hotel. So some pretty sophisticated devices. But what goes wrong normally isn't the disruption of the bomb, it's the location of it. And that's what terrorists are really good at, is kind of hiding these things. And we saw it here recently. I don't know if you followed the news in Austin, in Austin, Texas. But these bombs that were showing up on people's doorsteps, and they just look like innocuous packages. They don't look like any threat. So if you don't know it's there, that's probably the biggest thing, and that's really in most cases what we've seen with our deaths in combat and our severely injured, was that the bomb was just hidden very well, and it was either controlled or victim operated, and somebody stepped on it, or hit it with a shovel or drove over it. Those types of things.
Interesting. So, how much of, like, when you think about post-traumatic stress in this context with people involved in bomb disposal, say, how much of it has to do with like those traumatic events of a bomb going off, and how much of it has to do with the actual insane stress that must come along from just doing the job in the first place?
Yeah, well, this is what's so interesting to me, is that so after all this happened, and I read this book I just described, I jumped on an airplane, I bought a ticket, and I literally went around to the top psychiatrists and psychologists in our country, anybody I could find that was really doing meaningful research or something innovative in PTSD work. And I've talked with some amazing people, Francine Shapiro, who invented EMDR, and Frank Okenberg, who led the PTSD diagnostic and the DSM, back in 1980, through the 70s, and finally made the diagnosis, in 1980. So I've talked to some of the best in the world. And even Frank said to me one time, he said, I think probably the biggest professional mistake of my life was, diagnosing this. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he says, because we just can't afford in our world to give labels. And I went to Harvard, I went to the University of Chicago, I met some really cool people, and I would hear things like, well, the PTSD treatment we're doing for combat veterans doesn't work. And I finally said, in San Francisco, I'd heard that about 3 times, and I finally said to the psychiatrist, I said, if it doesn't work, why in the hell are you doing it? And he said, well, the truth is, it's the only thing that's approved in the DSM, and it's the only thing that the insurance companies reimburse for. And I looked at him, and he said, well, why are you so interested in this as a bomb disposal guy? And I said, well, listen, I come from a profession where you just can't make mistakes, right? We train over and over and over. And if you do make a mistake and get away with it, you damn sure don't do it a second time. And I said, I just don't understand this philosophy that you're really working with human beings who should be living a very meaning and productive life after combat. And you're telling me that you just keep doing this therapy and it's not working, and you're not getting below clinical thresholds of depression or PTSD scores. And it just blew my mind. And I've tested a lot of things in my life. I had a company after I retired from the Navy that tested technology primarily on the battlefield in some very austere environments, and to see if it worked. And I understand, program evaluation, and I understand, research and development. And I'm thinking we should be able to do better than this. And that's kind of what got me really going.
And what were they? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, on that journey, the last man I met with was Dr. Rich Tedeschi at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And Tedeschi, 35 years ago, had coined this term in research called post-traumatic growth. Now, I think that the science of it and the philosophy of it dates back to pre-biblical terms. And there's references even in the Bible of struggle, But my favorite book in the world is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I think that, I really believe in what Frankl's writings are about. And that's what I said, is that if a guy like Frankl can come out of a concentration camp and become this remarkable human being that's not held back by what happened in the past, how do we do that? How do we teach that? And I said on this trip to Tedeschi, I said, hey, Rich, I really understand your research and what you've done. And primarily, and I don't know how familiar you are with Rich's research, but primarily what Rich was researching was families who had lost children to cancer, which arguably is, probably the worst thing that could happen to a human. And, although these parents, would have traded their lives to have their child back, they had gone on to do these really remarkable things in the aftermath of this trauma. So I said to Rich, do you have any relevant stories about, veterans? Have you done everything with veterans? And he said, Ken, we studied prisoners of war from Vietnam. And I said, well, what'd you find out? And he said 30% of the Vietnam war generation came home from the war with PTSD, 30%. And that, by the way, that percentage is roughly true for our current generation. Statistically speaking, you see numbers between 20.6 and 30. But we think it's probably pretty close to 30 because most people don't go, seek help and get officially diagnosed. And he said, well, what do you think the number of prisoners of war who came home from Vietnam with PTSD? And I said, well, it must have been 100% because I've been through SEER training, which is the training that we teach how to survive and escape if you're ever in that scenario. And I just personally, and none of my friends I've ever talked to can think of anything worse than being captured and tortured on the battlefield. And I said, it must be 100%. And he said, no, it was 4. And I said, what? And then we started this conversation. I started reading about prisoners of war, Admiral James Stockdale and his leadership during these, prison camps. And that's what really got me going on post-traumatic growth. And that's when I believe that if you can come out of trauma that severe, then we've got to be able to do stuff for people that are less severe. So I'm not sure that answered your question, Jason, but I wanted you to know that background on PTG.
No, that definitely answered my question. So what are some, like you mentioned at the beginning there, where you were talking about, some of the treatments that were widely employed that weren't effective. What are those treatments and how are they still, widely in practice today?
Yeah. Oh yeah. The two approved treatments for military PTSD are prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. There's some cognitive behavioral therapy stuff that goes on. There's some EMDR that's kind of making it in. There's some interesting things. One of the challenges is people that don't have PTSD, that don't have an empathetic bone in their body, which by the way is a lot of people, tend to wonder why in the hell this, you can't get better quickly. And as you know, people battle depression for years. It just doesn't, one session doesn't do anything. So I was talking to Francine Shapiro. We were talking about the EMDR protocol, which is like 22 meaningful sessions. And then the military is like, well, we can't afford to have, guys gone for 22 sessions. Is there any way you could do it shorter? So, innovation in the military was somebody trying to do EMDR in 5 days. And then in the special forces community, where I had spent some time in my career, they couldn't even stomach 5 days of their guys being gone. So somebody came up with something called advanced resolution therapy, or ART, and it was supposed to be done in 1 session. And I'm thinking, this is crazy, man. It's like, number one, we have people that come into the military with severe baggage, childhood trauma and things that, that are 18 years, ingrained in their body. And then they go to war and they see death and they kill people and their best friends are killed. And you're telling me that in 1 session, you're going to heal somebody? And it's like, it's almost like hypnosis. And I started getting really angry because I kept thinking, we people can't go around and just, say that you can make the sign of a cross over somebody and they're healed. It's just, that's not the way life works. And that was really when I kept going back to Franco and these prisoners of war stories and trying to say, how do you fix this?
You mentioned special forces. Is there a different level of, maybe a different type of personality or a different level of emotional resiliency that's developed through that kind of special forces training that makes those people more, resilient, I guess, or more protected from PTSD? Are the numbers kind of similar?
Well, no, I think the percentages are similar. So there's a couple things that happen in the special forces community that I think that are unique. One is that they have multiple deployments. So you have guys that'll go 2 or 3 months, to Africa. They're back for 2 or 3 months. They're back again for 2 or 3 months to Syria. They're back again for 2 or 3 months. They're back again to the Philippines. It's like just nonstop. The pace has been amazingly especially now the most of the wars have wound down. Most of the operations going on are special operations. So it's a lot of back to back stuff. And so that's one of the things so there's two words that are used in the PTSD world that I don't necessarily subscribe to. And that is the word resilience and this word empower, because I really get frustrated by people that think that they can empower other people to do things because I think we're all created equal and that nobody should have that kind of power over us to do that. Because I think if you believe in Frankl's writings that people should and do have the choice to make these decisions on their own in their life. But on the subject of resilience, the literal definition of resilience is the ability to bounce back. Now, so let's just say you're suffering and you have another traumatic event, and you're bouncing back maybe just to where you were suffering. So what Tedeschi's philosophy is that really what you should do is not bounce back, but you should bounce higher. And I always give people this kind of analogy of a Super Bowl. You throw the Super Bowl against the wall and it hits the wall and comes back at you twice as fast as you threw it. And that's what we hope with post-traumatic growth is that people will actually become better versions of themselves and not just bounce back. So I always think of, I used to work with the SEAL teams and as a bomb disposal guy, and I always think of walking into the SEAL team and saying, all right, guys, I'm here to teach you how to be resilient. And I think they're going to kick my ass and throw me out the door. And I'm like, these are the most resilient human beings in the world. And when you use that kind of vocabulary, so a statistic I think that your listeners really should understand is that 50%, and just this is in the United States, I think, by the way, it's very similar in Canada, 50% of veterans who suffer with the symptoms of PTSD will never seek help. 50%. You know why? Because of two stigmas. This is a RAND study. This isn't Ken Falke's research. This is a study by RAND, the RAND Corporation. Because first, the stigma associated with mental health care. The second is what they call the lack of cultural attunement between the warrior and the therapist. Right? So if that connection doesn't occur in a very short period of time, then, the soldier gets up, walks out, and never goes back. So the treatment never even gets a fair chance. That's the other problem, is that some of these treatments work if the guys go through them, but you're talking very, very small percentages. And that's really what's interesting. So I think that we use words like the ability to handle, adversity from trauma, multiple trauma, adversity, those types of things, because really that's the human condition, is that all of us are going to live this life that looks like a sine wave of ups and downs. And, we never know what's going to happen the next day. I mean, I might get in my car today and, God forbid, but I get in my car today and my brand new car gets wrecked, and it doesn't mean I have to go into depression for 3 months and get diagnosed with PTSD because I was in a car accident, but who knows what's going to happen. I've got an old dog sitting here with me right now that is really on her last legs, and it's going to be devastating when she goes. But, at the end of the day, I know that's life, and I'm going to grieve, but I've got to be able to get better and do more. Right. So that's kind of our philosophy.
How much when you mentioned a couple of reasons why people don't seek treatment, and one thing that I find interesting, so I run a community of men called Mental Health Warriors, and in doing this podcast, and I've talked to so many of them, and there's so many people that have some variation of the same story, which is I experienced some terrible trauma, whether it was, there's first responders in that group. So whether it's, that type of something happened on the job, or it's childhood abuse, or whatever these things are. And they don't make I think there's a few reasons this happens, but they don't make the connection between what happened then and what they're experiencing now. So, and so when we talk about that, like when I look at my wife, for example, my first wife who took her own life after she was a police officer and she had a horrible, horrible childhood. And I look at all the treatment that she went through when she was completely out of control and emotionally dysregulated and, spiraling out of control for years. And there was not one time anybody ever said, like, hey, what happened to you? Like it was, oh, you're fucked up right now? Oh, let me give you some medication. That was basically what it was like. So how much of it is too that people don't make the connection between, say, the trauma that they've experienced and the symptoms and the trauma they've experienced in the past and the symptoms they're experiencing in the present?
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear that news of your wife and first wife. because that story, and just in the bomb. By the way, I do a lot of work with non-bomb disposal personnel, but just in our small bomb disposal community, which is in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines here in the U.S. We've had 133 men and women since 9/11 killed on the battlefield, and as of 2 weeks ago, we had our 134th suicide. So it's brutal, and that's. I said this the other night. I was a speaker at an event in D.C. the other night, and I said, don't tell me that what we're doing is working. Because 20 veterans a day in the United States are killing themselves, and that number has been the same for the last 10 years. So if what we're doing is working, that number should be 19 by the end of this year, or 18, or 16. But don't keep telling me what we're doing is working, because it's not, and we need innovation and we need some stuff. But I think here's what I really believe is that, and I've seen this now very closely for the last 5 years here at Boulder Crest Retreat. Childhood trauma is significant, and I don't think the average American really understands that. I live in the richest county in the United States, Loudoun County, Virginia, and that's measured by annual revenue or income of the average person. We're right outside of DC. It's a thriving county and really, really doing well. And 30 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, we have MS-13 gangs. We have an opioid crisis. We have a heroin problem. We have a abused women's shelter that does not have enough beds. We've got a food bank that can't keep food on the shelves. And this is in the richest county in the United States. And let's just say that's multiplied by 5 or 10 or 2, in the rest of the world. And this childhood trauma is significant. And most of us get through it. And most of us get into adulthood through that trauma. But at the end of the day, you're still carrying it. And I always kind of try to give this rucksack analogy. Like, you got this rucksack on your back, and you've got some childhood trauma in there. You got some sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional or neglect or poverty, whatever these, what we call adverse childhood experiences are. And then you become a first responder. And my dad was a cop. My dad left the Army in 1959 and became a DC cop in 1960, and was here in the Washington, D.C. area when the worst times in D.C., when the riots were going on in the 60s and those types of things. And you become a cop, and the first thing you're exposed to on your first real tragedy you're exposed to, let's say, is the Florida school shootings. And there's kids laying on the ground dead. And now you've just added this other rock. Maybe it's 15 kids that are dead. So you've added 15 more rocks to this rucksack. And at some stage in the game, if those rocks are trauma, it breaks our back. And that's what happens. It leads at the worst end, leads to suicide. It leads to drug and alcohol abuse. It leads to, all the things that we all know that are happening. And that's the same, with the military. And quite frankly, it's the same with everybody. It just seems that first responders and military personnel are exposed to the most horrific things that, humanity's got to offer. But, I've met civilians who had severe, sexual trauma as a child and have persevered through it and gone on to do some remarkable things. And I've met some civilians that, have, what a therapist might call something like emotional paper cuts, where they just got a lot. Their parents got divorced. There was never really any neglect in the family, other than the fact that they were, single parent raised, and, the parents maybe yelled, and the kids thought maybe the parents got divorced and it was my fault. So you start getting all these smaller things kind of going on in your life, and they just keep, maybe they're not rocks, like 15 kids dead in a school in Florida, but maybe they're pebbles. But even pebbles at some stages of the game are going to get so heavy that you can't carry this trauma. And that's what really starts to happen when people have the emotional breakdowns.
So as you discover, so you realize there's a better, you start thinking there's a better way to do things. One thing I'm curious about is, did you have any sort of hesitancy you're wondering how it's possible that you've come up with this idea? I always wonder this about people who go against the grain, go against all the conventional wisdom, see a different idea. I mean, was there a process where you had to go through, where you're thinking to yourself, is it possible that I'm discovering something that's never existed before? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I always take that as a compliment because I get called a contrarian all the time, and I embrace that term. Somebody just bought me. My birthday was earlier this week, and somebody bought me a book written by Adam Grant called Originals, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It says Originals: How Nonconformists Move the World. So I don't know if I would categorize myself in that, but I'll tell you a little bit of how I got to where I'm at. So in this first year, we had Boulder Crest Retreat open here in Virginia, which was 2013. We allowed a lot of small nonprofits who were doing what we thought were some innovative things: songwriting with soldiers, horse therapy, time with dogs, all these really kind of cool things that were off the mainstream. They weren't approved by insurance, should be, and let them use our retreat to run programs. We saw everything from a 1-day kind of get to know a dog and a horse program to a 2-week military sexual trauma program. Matter of fact, we hosted the first male military sexual program in the United States here at our facility. It was 2 weeks long, but mostly based on EMDR. And we watched this, and I kept learning a couple things. And I'll say the first one, with respect of great therapists, because there are some great psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health therapists out there. We all know that. But I met some kooks. And that was one of the biggest thing. And there's in research, there's a great paper written out of the United Kingdom on the science of what's called a wounded healer. And a lot of people get into the mental health business because they feel that if they're helping others, they're going to help themselves. And there's some truth to that, by the way. And in the world of post-traumatic growth, we would call that an expert guide, somebody that will help you through the journey because they've already been there. But let me tell you, if you're not well and you're trying to help other people, not only is it a disaster for you, but it's a disaster for that person sitting on the other side of the table. And I met some people that were not well and continue to meet them every day. And I really challenge people that are in this business to look deep in the mirror. By the way, I think the suicidal rate of mental health professionals is 3 times more than society. So this isn't my observation was, wow, this person's a kook, and I'm not going to let him touch another one of my military brothers or sisters here at my retreat. But we did see some innovative things, and I'll just give you a quick story why I'm so much into non-traditional healing. In 1989, I broke my back in a parachute jump, and I was told initially I may never walk again, but I definitely was told that I would not probably be a bomb disposal guy in the Navy again. And I took this as a challenge, which I'm kind of, and part of me always hopes the doctor kind of gave me that as a challenge. But in addition to my hard work, I really came out of this because the physical therapy they had assigned me to in the Navy, I had this young girl who was probably right out of hospital corpsman school doing physical therapy for me. And I'd lay on a bed that she'd put some electrode probes on my back. And then, I'd get up and they'd give me another bottle of Motrin 800s. And finally, a friend of mine said, have you ever thought about seeing a chiropractor? And in 1989, chiropractors were witch doctors. And I said,
yeah.
I don't know what the hell it is, but I said, I'm willing to try anything at this point. I don't want this to, stop my life. And I ended up going to this chiropractor. It was a chiropractor that practiced something called directional non-force technique, which was even worse than traditional chiropractic from a witch doctor perspective. But I had this, in addition to breaking my back, I dislocated my left shoulder, and I couldn't raise my arm above my shoulder for 3 months after my accident. I walked out of one chiropractic appointment swinging my arm. I could have thrown a baseball. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And today, here we are, almost 30 years later, here we are, and chiropractic treatment is pretty mainstream. It's insurance reimbursable in most places. There's not a hospital or a clinic or in a town around, at least in the United States, you don't see chiropractic signs. In the VA, the Veterans Administration here in the United States, we have chiropractors in our DoD hospitals today, our Department of Defense hospitals. We have chiropractors. And that's what I hope for this non-traditional care and by the way, most of this stuff, things like yoga, meditation, these are thousands of years old. These aren't stuff that was turned, by Freud in the turn of the century. I mean, these are thousands of year old things that are proven to work. So that's kind of that. But to be called a contrarian and really look at it, I looked at all these small programs that were coming through our retreat, and I said, there's some good things here. Let's pick them out. And we started talking to people that were into some interesting, healthcare, chiropractic, acupuncture, acupressure, massage therapy, horses, dogs. And we just started picking little things and saying, well, what if we could create something that exposed people to a lot of things? Because at the end of the day, if you believe that life is a choice and you've got to make these choices, then the more we can expose you to that's quantified and qualified as good, then the better choices you have to find the things that work for you to help you get better. So I'm not a big fan of therapy dogs, although I have two, and we have visiting therapy dogs here. I often think that men and women will get a dog to walk around because they haven't lost their legs to tell people that they're injured. But let me tell you, there's many, many dogs that have saved people's lives. But dogs are codependent, and codependent relationships are never healthy. So you can't just have a dog and think that's going to allow you to live a meaning and productive life. You've got to do things that are other things. If you're lucky enough to have time with horses and you don't own your own horses, that can be very expensive. So maybe you only see horses for a week, but there's 6 more days in that week that you got to live. So those horses may help you, but they can't be you, because you've got to be you. And that's the message that we really want people to understand, is that, there are a lot of things out there to help you, but at the end of the day, what you really got to do is help yourself. And that's where that choice comes into play. So.
No, I think that's so powerful. And, one thing I'm curious about is how the stories people tell themselves about the trauma they've experienced influence how they cope with that trauma. So, I mean, using myself as an example, my wife was mentally ill for a long time. She took her own life, and I cope with that by just drinking like a fish, basically. And because I had no self-awareness, I'd done no personal development work. I was really wrapped up in this idea. I mean, I was in the military when I was younger. I was always, my way of looking at the world was that of like an alpha male. I didn't really understand any other way to interact with the world. And as I go through this, after her death, I'm drinking for like 3-4 years heavily after her death. And so I finally stop, and I start doing all this self-development work and, developing my sense of self-awareness and self-mastery. And as I go through that and I'm learning, what I realize is I'm telling myself different stories about what happened, and it's incredibly liberating. So where before, it's like, oh, these were the dark times, I was a victim, blah, 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 all this shit. And the way I look at it now, for example, is, what happened is neither good or bad. It just is an event that happened. And I choose, because when I look at it now, there's so many good things that also came out of it. Yes, there was a tragic element to it, but there's an incredible amount of goodness that came out of it for myself and all of the people that I've managed to help. And so labeling it, telling yourself these stories and labeling it as one thing or another, I think can be really detrimental. So how do you see that playing out in how people, say, heal from the trauma they've experienced?
Well, I think, Jason, what you just described is post-traumatic growth. Here you are in this expert guide role, helping others now, and it's like, going through there. And I think what you said is exactly what I believe, and how you've taken on this challenge for yourself. So I love cars, and I'm going to give you a couple car analogies. The first one is I tell people in a very layman's approach what PTSD is, and it's this kind of desire, to if you believe a couple. Let me quantify this really quickly. If you believe a couple things, one is that depression is really about worrying about what happened in the past, and anxiety is really this problem of worrying about what's going to happen in the future. So let's start with that premise for a minute. So you save all your money up, and I won't say it's my dream car, because I think I have my dream car, but let's just say you want this beautiful red Ferrari, right? It's $500,000, and you work and work and work your whole life, and you finally get enough money to buy this car. And you go down to the dealership and you give them the money, write them a check to pay cash for a $500,000 car, and it's beautiful. And you sit in the driver's seat and you put your foot on the brake and you press the start button. And you literally are ready to have an orgasm in the seat, right? There's so much excitement. And then you drive out, they open the door of the dealership and you drive out and you drive home in this beautiful red Ferrari going 10 miles an hour looking in the rearview mirror. Maybe not even 10 miles an hour. And that's kind of PTSD. And really what needs to happen in that car is that you got to be present. You got to learn how to live in the present, because that car is full of interesting controls and paddles on the steering wheel to shift, and a comfortable seat, and nowadays lots of digital technology that help you get your phone connected and your navigation and whatever else. So you got to be able to live in that present. And this car's got this windshield that's 5 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and it goes 200 miles an hour. And once you are present, then you can put your foot down on the gas and go. And as any good driving school will teach you, if you don't look in these mirrors, the side mirrors, the rearview mirror, you're going to die. Right? You change lanes in a Ferrari at 110 miles an hour, and you hit another car, you're probably going to die. So you've got to look in the rearview mirror and kind of revert, but you can't let that rearview mirror hold you back. And that's life. And driving in that windshield is really what is all about goal setting. And now if you take the road you're driving on and you draw two really heavy lines on it to keep you in a safe environment, one of those lines is exactly what you talked about, self-regulation. Because people that can't self-regulate, self-medicate, as you mentioned, drinking in your case, and self-medication leads us into places that are very, very difficult to come out of. I think the recidivism rate in alcohol and drug rehab is 90-some%. I mean, it's crazy. Once you get down that road, it's very, very difficult. So you've got to be able to self-regulate. What does that look like? Meditation, exercise, yoga, reading, trying to gain wisdom, mastering yourself. There's lots of different ways of doing this. But, when shit hits the fan, you got to be able to take a deep breath and regulate. And in the military, we teach this over and over again. We teach breathing techniques on how to shoot a gun when you're on the range. And these techniques are forgotten when it comes to PTSD. On the other side of the road is another line, and that is your network, the people you spend time with. Because as human beings, we thrive on relationships, whether or not, you ever hear somebody say, oh, I'm just going to go live off the grid. I don't like people anymore. That person's normally an ass. But at the end of the day, most people thrive on relationships and humans. We become the average of the 3 to 5 people we spend the most time with. So if you're sitting around with 3 to 5 drunks feeling sorry for yourself, you're going to be a drunk. Same with drug addicts, whatever it is. If you can't break out of this, bad network and find quality people in your life, including family members, by the way, and we call it pruning, right? So if you've got toxic family members and you can't get them out of your life, it's very difficult. And family's harder than friends, but at the end of the day, you've got to get a network of people who can help you when these times are tough. Now, don't get me wrong. You may have a hockey team that you go drinking beer with on Thursday nights and eat chicken wings, and it's the funnest group of guys in the world. But there's not one guy on that team that, when you're in trouble, really going to be the ears that you need to help you through those challenges. So your 3 to 5 are really the people that you spend the most time with, and getting the quality people around you will help you stay in this road as you're driving that car really fast. So, and that's the way life goes. Life goes fast, man. It seems like as I'm getting older, it's going faster too. So that's our philosophy.
Wow, that lines up. That we are singing from the same hymn book here, because I just believe the human connection is the antidote to so much of what ails us. And we look at, like, when you take people, like some of the things everything you just talked about applies to everybody, post-traumatic stress or not. I mean, so many of us are conditioned to believe that we are passengers in life and that stuff happens to us, and that we can't, that our power to actually influence the direction of our lives people don't understand how powerful they could actually be. And when you look at, like, some of the things we were talking about building a network, I can remember the first time I heard that quote, that Jim Rohn quote about, 3 to 5 people you spend the most time with. I was riding my bike home from work, and I had just started listening to podcasts, and I was thinking to myself, man, that sounds like it makes sense, but how in the hell do I even do that? Like, I've got my family, I've got my, my longtime friends, which, like you said, were the type of drinking buddies, where we never went deep on anything. It was just, shoot the shit and whatever. And, I've got my coworkers, and honestly, my only concept of how I could get a different type of person in my life was to go to some really awkward business networking event and stand there with a name tag on feeling like an idiot. And that seemed so awful to me that I couldn't even conceive of how to do it. But we run these mastermind groups. That's what my actual business is running mastermind groups for men. And when these guys come in these groups, like, yes, we teach them a curriculum about self-awareness, self-mastery, selfless service to others. But what the most benefit they get out of being in the group is being in a safe place around other guys, being able to talk about stuff that a lot of times they've never been able to say out loud to anybody ever. They've never had this type of relationship with people. And when they do, that's the thing. That's the foundation or the springboard that allows them to actually start to grow past where they ever have before. It's to me, it's just human connection is like the people that can be the type of people that foster human connection. Those are the type of people that go further than they ever could have imagined.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And in the world of post-traumatic growth, if you look at the framework of post-traumatic growth, what you just described is what we would call disclosure. And until that disclosure, right, if you're carrying this trauma and it's never disclosed, and this rucksack just keeps getting heavier and heavier. So groups like your mastermind group, you kind of allow these guys to come in and dump these rucksacks out and really figure out what's important in their lives and repack that, and like I said, you're never going to forget if you were sexually molested as a child, if your parents were divorced. In my case, my mom died when I was 7 years old. She had cancer and she was only 29. In your wife's case, you're never going to forget that stuff, and you never should. You never should. But at the end of the day, you can move beyond it, and that's the condition that the human thrive in. And what I get frustrated with. So I was with a friend of mine. I think I said earlier in the podcast that I spoke at an event in DC the other night. A friend of mine, former Navy SEAL, really, really has done well in his life. His son, I was with him the week after his son graduated from SEAL training. And last April, his son took his own life. And when his son died, he was on 40 different medications from the military. Out of those 40, 8 of them had side effects of suicide. And it's like this system, we love, and I don't know if it's as bad in Canada as it is in the United States. My wife's from London, England, and I know the medical system there pretty well because we've watched both of her parents, pass there. And it's not that great either, and I don't think most medical systems are that great. But in the United States, we tend to want to pathologize everything.
Oh yeah, it's like that here too, man.
It's like you're a military sexual survivor. You're dealing with a moral injury. It's like, no, dude, I'm not dealing with a moral injury. My best friend died, or maybe it's like what I'm dealing with is life. And this, I raised my right hand. I enlisted in the military. Nobody told me I had to go do this, and now I'm dealing with this thing. And if I put a label on myself. I always tell people that there's 2 really important questions in life that take you at a fork in the road. One is why, which I think is Frankl's work, is asking this question why and trying to get as deep into the answer as you can possibly get. And the other one is why me. When you ask why me, and you're that individual with the cloud over your head, that's when victimization occurs. When you look at the way the medical system pathologizes these mental health issues, it's almost like they're putting this brand on you that you can't get better. and in post-traumatic growth. So I'll just tell you, we're 12 months into an 18-month study on the work we're doing. Our results are about 3 times as effective as traditional mental health care for military PTSD, just to quantify that. Although I do think very highly of this program, I think it would be very effective for anybody, not just military folks. But in the mental health world, all they measure is symptom reduction, right? So let's say the clinical diagnosis of PTSD is a score of 38. If you come to me for 12 weeks and I get you to a 36 and below this clinical threshold line, I call that success. And that's bullshit. Because if you're not measuring the quality of life and what's happening on the other side, then then to me, what you're doing is you're kind of almost putting the brand on this person so that for the rest of their life, they're going to live a diminished version of themselves. And it's just this whole mantra of, am I surviving or am I thriving? And that's the difference between post-traumatic growth. So we've seen some therapists and some psychiatrists and psychologists incorporate post-traumatic growth into things like prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, and their results, are magnified. But when you just try to get people, to understand what's wrong with them and medicate them and, treat them like a child and all these things that happen. I read this article a year ago or something about cuddling therapy. And then I read this other article about these weighted blankets. And I'm thinking, I have been in combat where guys are literally sleeping in mud holes under their vehicles and for 6 and 7 hours. I mean, like quality sleep. And now you're going to bring these guys home from combat and you're going to wrap them up in a blanket and swaddle them like a baby. I'm like, what the hell are we doing to these people? It's like, it's crazy. It just blows my mind. And that's the reason some people love it is because they're for the first time in their medical environment, they're getting attention. Mm-hmm. That's something that I think hasn't been researched a lot. So I'm at this kind of philosophy when it comes to the mental health world that nothing works and everything works, and depending on what placebo effect I've got a great paper called The Placebo Effect, Why Nothing Works, and I believe that the reason things do work, like weighted blankets and that kind of stuff, isn't because there's any science behind it, but it's for the first time maybe in this individual's life, somebody has cared enough to give them a blanket and help take care of them. And there's a lot of that, especially when you look at severe, childhood trauma where somebody's never had anything. And it's brutal. And that's why I think something's got to be scientifically based, and people need to learn, like your Mindshare program, people need to learn how to live meaningful lives on their own.
Yeah. And, I'm interested in talking, you mentioned, for the process of post-traumatic growth, and you mentioned the disclosure phase, and I'm interested in talking more about the process. But before we do that, one of the things I noticed, and I think this is what I was getting at the very beginning of our call is, so, I've done a fair amount of work with first responders, speaking to them. And even when I started this podcast, I had a different idea of what I wanted this podcast to be about. But as I've gone through and I've learned from people, I'm so sick of talking. Like, I don't want to talk to people I want to talk about the things that we're talking about, because I think this is the key that will unlock a different future for people. So my original thought was to have, people on telling their stories about their, trauma and giving them a voice and all that. And I mean, that's important, but it's like, what do you do about it? Right. Like, and how do we take these lessons and actually move forward with them? That's what I'm interested in talking about right now, because I see so many people in the quote PTSD world who are just constantly labeling themselves as having PTSD. Right. And I wonder, what is that creating in your life? I mean, we all know that, just the language that we use, shapes the lens through which we see the world. So if you're walking around constantly telling yourself you've got PTSD, how can that possibly be helping you move forward? You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm really thinking, my thinking around this has really changed over the last year. So I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Well, and I think you're right, because it doesn't help anybody move forward. And that's this whole challenge, is that if the system is going to pathologize us, label us, which they have to do for insurance purposes, I get all that bullshit. But at the end of the day, you can't accept those labels and make that yours. Am I going to walk around and tell everybody, well, I'm a broken back survivor, or a spinal cord injury survivor, and it's like, there's no reason for that. And it's like even the most severe guys. I've got a young Navy EOD guy. He's the war's fifth quadruple amputee in the United States. Lost all 4 limbs when he stepped on an IED. In a very complex situation. Trying to save the lives of Army Special Forces guys. This EOD guy jumped out in front and ran to try to clear, a path where these guys could get safe from an ambush, and stepped on an IED and lost all 4 limbs. When you're around this guy, you want to be him, right? It's like, holy cow, how can you be so positive? He's left the military. He's built his own house. He's just graduated from college. He's opened up a maker space in his town where he's focusing on 3D printing with high school children. And I mean, this guy is like just kicking ass and taking names. And I'm thinking, well, if he can do it, if a prisoner of war can do it, why can't we all? And that's really what I believe. But let me kind of tell you a little bit. So the framework of post-traumatic growth is really is simple, but it's not what I want to make sure that you and then the listeners understand. And Tedeschi's really beat me up on this. This isn't a mechanistic process, right? There's phases of it, but you do certain things at certain times, and you may go back, the next time a trauma occurs and do another part. But the first thing is the whole concept of education, understanding that regardless of really what's happened, and in the psychotherapy world, they would call this psycho education. Really understand what's going on in your brain and your body, and understanding things like, fight and flight mechanisms in your brain, and the disconnection of our hearts and souls when we're not doing things, for anybody other than ourselves, and, all this kind of psychoeducation, and then really understanding that growth is possible after the trauma. And by the way, in that education process, understanding other stories like you've shared this morning, stories like prisoners of war and Viktor Frankl have shared, understanding those kind of stories is in the education process. The next thing is regulation, really just understanding and being able to get this stuff off your chest, and not having to live with the shame and guilt associated with the traumas you're carrying. I don't know if you've listened to Brene Brown much, but she does a great piece on shame, and it's like that shame and guilt's got to get out, man. And if it doesn't, you're going to carry that for the rest of your life, and it just literally holds you back. And then after disclosure, the next real major thing is creating this positive new story of what's going to happen in your life, and then this ability to regulate is the next thing. Is that how do we self-regulate on this new journey? So that I always tell people there's a great poem called The Dash. Have you ever read it?
No, I haven't.
So this poem, it basically, you look at a tombstone and you've got your birth date and your death date.
Oh, yes, I have. Yeah.
And in the middle, you got this dash, and it's like, how do you live this dash? And this whole concept of living when you're living, and we do an exercise here where we literally will write your obituary, write your own obituary, and how do you want to be remembered? And then you step back and you say, okay. Which, by the way, I've never met anybody who wrote, I want to be an asshole, right? Or this guy was an asshole. But
for sure,
people write this stuff and then they go, well, now how do you live that? Right? I want to be a great father. Well, you're not a great father if you're beating your kids and molesting them. You're not a great father if you're not working and making space for your family at a dinner table. So it's like, how do you live that life that you say you want to be? And that's where goal setting comes really in our program, where you set these goals and have accountability partners and then do it. And then the last one is service. And I'm not a religious guy, but I believe in spirituality, and I define spirituality in three ways. One is our character. Are you at the core of who you are? Are you a good person? Do you have the characteristics of what a good person looks like, or is, not even looks like? Because a lot of people look good, but they aren't, on the backside. The second one is relationships, because as I said earlier, that we thrive on relationships. So are you in healthy relationships that are going to allow you to be of service to others? And the third thing is the service to others. And I tell people that even in the worst times, when you're traumatically, you're not in a good place, and you're fighting some of the demons that we fight in life, go do something for somebody else. Make it small. Don't go start a nonprofit. Don't go try to save the world, but just go down to the church and slop some soup and at the soup kitchen, or go pick up trash alongside of the road, but go do something for somebody other than yourself. And as you get better, I call it the concentric rings of life, is that you get yourself healthy, you get your family and friends healthy, you get your community healthy, and then maybe if you really have high expectations, you go get your nation healthy. And if you bypass, we call it the spiritual bypass, if you never get yourself healthy and you try to jump into getting others healthy which is one of the wounded healer concepts in the mental health community, then you've bypassed your spiritual strength. Let's say it at the worst case scenario that you try to jump from not being healthy to helping your nation. Now what are you doing, right? It's like, and we see that all over the world. It's like, not just in sophisticated governments, but all over the world. Is that when you try to do something really big and you're not healthy, shit hits the fan for a lot more people. So it's that's concentric rings of service, and that's how we define spirituality. So in our program, we really focus on 4 areas of life, and that's mind, body, spirit, and finances. And we add finances in, and I know, in Canada as well, that you need money to live, and it's real, and people kind of resonate with it. So I was with a soldier yesterday, and he said, my wife and I are really struggling. I said, well, let's talk about a little bit what's going on. And he said, we're having some real financial difficulties. And I'm thinking, well, my dad used to say to me, don't spend more than you make. And, I'm kind of trying to work with him now to get him a good budget and make sure we fully understand what's going on. But, it's a shame when your marriage ends in a divorce because the two of you can't agree on how much money to spend and where to spend it and what the priorities in life are, So I think you got to bring a lot of this realism in, which the mental health community doesn't. Excuse me. The mental health community doesn't, but you got to bring a lot of this realism in if you want people to get healthy.
I'm listening to you talk, and I can't believe the similarities between what you teach and what we teach in our mastermind groups. It's crazy. Like we get guys to do their obituary too, and it's very similar. And one of the things, like, it's so interesting. I think so many of us think we need to go from where we are right now to helping the nation, right? So what we always tell guys is we'll do their obituary, and then we'll say, like, what's a gap between the man you are right now, just pick one, like identify a gap between the man you are right now and the man you said you wanted to be in that obituary. And then what would you like to see instead of that gap? And we walk them through this little process of saying, they'll say what they would like to see instead. Well, what would be even better than that? And what might even be even better than that? But then the important part is, so they've got this idea of who they could be, and it's vivid and evocative, and they're connected to it. But now the real power in the exercise is saying, what's something small you could do right now to start making that happen? And they'll come up with something, usually that's way too big. And you say, what's even smaller than that? And what is something that's even smaller still? So you combine this idea of having this beautiful vision that they connect to with teaching them that the only way you make this stuff happen is by doing, like, it's, making marginal adjustments to your life, taking one small step, and those actions compound on themselves over time. I think so often when we look at whether we're dealing with post-traumatic stress or anything really, we want to make a change in our life, and we think we got to make this moonshot in order to make it happen. And that's not really how it works. So just listening to you talk it's amazing to hear somebody using the same, very similar methodology, but in a very different context. I love it.
Well, and 2 things I'll say to that. One is that one of the reasons, excuse me, those small steps are great is because then it gives you opportunity to celebrate, right? It's like,
yes,
I've got, I went to the soup kitchen, I walk out of there and I'm feeling like $1 million, for the first time now. And it helps you build empathy, and it helps you, become a better human. And those are the wins that kind of take us along this. So it really is important to have these small steps and win. And it's funny because I have a friend of mine who I was talking about this the other day, and we have a mutual friend who ended up becoming a U.S. congressman, and the guy never should be in politics, period. He won't get reelected. He's made some real mistakes, I think, in his life, but it's like he went from trying to go from step A to step D without taking B and C. And I think you can just look around the world and just see how that happens in spades. And the other thing is that I tell people all the time is that I think PTSD, especially in the military community, is as much of a leadership issue as it is a mental health issue. And what I mean by that is that if we had leaders like you, Jason, and the kind of things that we're doing, and you were teaching people how to live meaning and productive lives, That's leadership, right? It's like I have this definition of leadership that's not mine by any means, but I hold a master's degree from Georgetown University and did some really interesting leadership work at Georgetown. And one of the things that we did was these readings of definition. I think if you Google definition of leadership, you'll come up with 400 or 500 meaningful definitions of leadership. But the one I believe in is that you're helping people get to a place where they wouldn't get to on their own. And let's take that back to the basics of being a good brother or a good uncle, a good father, and how do you make that work as a leader in the smallest of ways, not just running a corporation or running a nonprofit or being a pastor in a church or whatever it might look like in a bigger perspective. But leadership happens at all levels of our life, and that's to me where we really missed the boat. And I started writing a piece the other night about the erosion of experience that's needed in leadership or that occurs. And you look. I mean, I can only right now look in the U.S. government how they people get to these very high levels who have really no experience and don't really deserve to be in those meaningful roles, and that people value people because of maybe how much money they donated to a cause or something, rather than valuing their experience. And this is an issue, right? And we talk about it in the book we wrote recently. We talk about this whole science of people providing advice versus providing true experience. So if you believe in our wellness model, mind, body, spirit, financial, if you were looking for real information about how to make your body better, and let's say your body is about fitness and nutrition and flexibility, and the things that we need to get through life and that hold us back if we don't have those. If we get really, really fat, it makes life much more harder, especially if you become diabetic and all those types of things. So how do you work on that fitness? And you're not going to go to a nutritionist who's fat, right? And this person's telling you what a diet should look like, and you're looking at them going, holy cow, it's like, how can you be telling me what to eat? You're completely obese. And then you go to a fitness guy who's, completely fit and he's doing great things, but you're not going to ask him for financial advice because he's running a gym and he's barely making his ends meet, or whatever it might be. So I think it's really important in life. And I don't think enough people do it is not to give advice, but to really seek out high quality experience. And this is what, when we talk about mentorship, this is what really we focus on is getting these experts in your life that have the experience, are living congruent, and congruent to us is your thoughts, feelings, and actions are aligned in a positive way. That you're not providing nutritional advice and then eating at McDonald's. It's like that. That's not congruent. So that's what we're really trying to do is teach people that seek out that right network so that they have the right 3 to 5 people in their lives for when they need them, and then there's these experts who can help them get through these challenging times.
So how do you help people get over the idea? I say this is something I say too all the time. And I think one of the things that holds people back is this, their own sense of self-worth and self-identity tells them that these people that you're talking about, these mentors and their experts, so many people think that they're not good enough, that people like that would take any interest in them or pay any attention to them. And my belief is that is absolutely untrue, because those people got to where they are. Like, people look at high-level entrepreneurs, for example, and they often think that, oh yeah, like corporate raider or whatever. But my experience is every single person I've ever met has been not every single person, but the vast majority of people I've met are kind, compassionate. They've gotten to where they are by serving others. But so many people believe that they're not good enough for anybody like that to pay attention to them. Is that something you run into?
You do. Yeah, you do. You see it a lot in the junior enlisted world of the military, and not always, but the percentages are much higher. So college educated officers tend to really understand the value of a network, understand how to talk to people. They through their own experience and training in college and they tend to create some good networks and positive people. But in the junior enlisted ranks, sometimes that's not possible. Your network and mentors consist of your fire team, maybe 3 to 5 guys that you're hanging around with, which may or may not have the experience you need. But I think really, it's self-worth is a very difficult thing to teach by any means. It's something that's built over time and time again. At the end of the day, we all kind of are the outcomes of our training. And what you have to do is have the bravery to seek these folks out and to start, again, just like we said a minute ago, start small. Don't try to, if you want to be a computer programmer, don't try to get a front door meeting with Bill Gates, but start small. And it's amazing what's going on in the communities. And again, I'm only going to speak for the U.S. because that's what I know, but it's amazing. I mean, our local community college has some amazing professors that are doing these things, and they'll have these groups at night where people want to learn about 3D printing, and you can go learn about 3D printing. And then what I always tell people is when you're in these classes, and maybe you want to learn how to play a guitar, when you're in these classes, then start to talk to the people that are sitting there with you, because something led them to that as well. And then you start to build this network of people that are trying to improve themselves, and that self-worth starts to go, wow, I'm not the only one in this boat. Now I've got 2 or 3 guys in the boat. We're all rowing, and we're taking, 3D printing classes, or we're taking guitar lessons together, or we're going to hike the Appalachian Trail on Saturday together, or, we're going to play hockey on Thursday night together, whatever that might be. Is all of a sudden it's like there's other people that are there. And that's why this disclosure is so important, because once you start having these deep conversations and people go, wow, you could be a friend of mine.
Yep. Oh, man.
And by the way, I just not to bash the mental health community any more than I do, but that doesn't happen in the world of therapy, right? It's like you have no clue what's sitting on the other side of the desk. They know everything about you because they want you to get in there and spill your guts for 50 minutes or an hour. But you'll never have a therapist reach across the table and say, oh, I know exactly how you feel. That happened to me. And, that shit doesn't happen. These are one-way conversations most of the time with, again, people who don't have great experience doing it. And again, I'm not saying anything that's not in writing. I mean, 50% of veterans don't go to mental health care because they don't believe that therapy is going to be helpful. So those are hard things to overcome. Stigmas are hard to overcome.
Yeah, for sure. I always tell people that really, if you want to understand how to start building a network and having some of these, interactions with people, it can come down to as simple as 7 words. Hey, I've struggled too, and I won't judge you if you want to talk to me, because if you can be the kind of person that makes it safe for everybody, for other people to be themselves, which is fundamentally what we all want in the first place, you become effective, influential, and powerful quicker than you could even imagine. But, so yeah, anyways.
Say those 7 words again, because I'm going to write them down. That's as powerful as it gets to me.
Yeah, I've struggled too. I won't judge you.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So anyways, your book, which I'm absolutely going to read, Struggle Well. So I'm assuming this is encapsulating all of the ideas we've been talking about in the podcast. Yeah.
So what we did is we keep getting asked this question is, we're starting to get some good attention on our programs, and we got to keep getting asked this question is, do you think this would work for civilians? And I said, absolutely. I mean, you're asking me if I think. So I think that it would. Do I think we need to study that a little bit? Absolutely. But I do think that it would work. And the more and more we've seen our success, I kept thinking, well, how could we share this word? And we just thought, well, let's write a book. And maybe the more people we can get this book out to, the better, and that would help people. And it's basically a very prescriptive book. It's not, there's some post-traumatic growth books you'll read, or there's some PTSD books you'll read, and they're full of stories on other people. Sally got in a horrible car accident, was paralyzed, and she went on to win gold medals at this event. And then you're sitting there as a person trying to suffer, or who's suffering, and going, well, how does Sally's story relate to me, right? And it's inspiring, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily telling you how to get the gold medal. So what we wanted to do was kind of walk people through this whole concept of post-traumatic growth through the 5 phases, talk about what the outcomes kind of look like, those efforts, and be able to share it in a more prescriptive kind of manner. So, there's some worksheets to do at a couple places where it leads you back to our website to download some things, to walk you through some of these disclosure exercises and things you can do on your own, things you can do with some great friends. And if that's even impossible for you, things you can do with a mental health therapist. Because the other thing that I'd love to say is that when you do seek out mental health therapy, to know that you're in the driver's seat, because you're the one that's making the payment at the end of the day for that treatment. So it'll be able to walk in, and this can happen as you start to get healthier, and tell your therapist, hey, I'd really love to sit down and do a disclosure thing. I've been reading about this. I need to get this stuff off my chest, and I just don't have a network of people that can help me. Would you be willing to listen to me for 45 minutes so I can get some stuff off my chest? And I think, as people get healthier and take their healthcare into their own hands better, those are really meaningful things. But there's a lot of people that think that therapist is in charge, and I always remind them of who's paying the medical bill. So it's really important for people to know that when they seek out treatment, that they're in the driver's seat.
That's great. Yeah, like I said, I'm going to read your book, and I know I'm going to love it, and I'm going to promote the hell out of it. So, I guess so. First of all, I want to say thank you for taking the time on Saturday morning to have this conversation with me. I knew I was going to love it, but I loved it even more than I thought. So for our listeners, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you and find out more about what you're doing?
Well, thank you, Jason, too, for having me on this morning. And do me a favor and email me your address, and I'll send you a book for sure, just as a thanks for doing this morning. But I've got a couple of email addresses that people can get hold of me. So right now, I really focus the majority of my time on raising money for our nonprofits. So you can see some of the stuff we're doing at the eodwarriorfoundation.org, actually eodwarriorfoundation.org, and then Boulder Crest Retreat, which is our bigger process. We have a retreat center here in Virginia. We have a retreat center just south of Tucson in Arizona now, and we're trying to expand this nationwide. We've actually talked to a few people up in Canada that are interested in doing this for first responders in the military. So sharing our curriculum, our big donor who paid for this curriculum to be developed has asked us to share it as widely as we can. So bouldercrestretreat.org, O-R-G. And then our new book is called Struggle Well, Thriving in the Aftermath of Trauma. Don't let the strong military guy on the front cover turn you off. It's not just for military people, but we did launch a website for that, and that's strugglewell.com.
That's amazing. Well, Ken, thank you very much for being on the show, and I wish you nothing but the best.
Well, thank you, Jason. Have a great Saturday.
Okay. And there you have it. I mean, seriously, cool. What an amazing conversation. I just got a lot of insight there. And yeah, like I said at the beginning, and I said it during the podcast too, it's really cool to see the different ways the same fundamental concepts can be applied, whether it's to the idea of, a mastermind group or helping people through post-traumatic stress or leadership. There's all kinds of ways that these truly foundational and really almost, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but these principles can be applied to basically everyone in basically every context. And that's really what I feel like my life's work is now, because I've discovered this, not I've discovered it, I discovered it for me. And it's made such a profound difference in my life and in the lives of other people. I've seen so many people, who by taking control of their choices and developing self-awareness and self-mastery and finding ways to selflessly serve others have profoundly changed their lives. So that's why I love this conversation. That's why I love the work that Ken's doing. I'll include all the links to his book in the show notes page, and definitely will be reading the book, and definitely will be doing a show on the book. So my thoughts and maybe like a little mini one-man book club. So I'll end this episode like I end every one, and that's by saying I've fucking struggled. I have. I talk about it enough times and still do sometimes, And however, if you ever want to talk to me, if it's not obvious by now that I will not judge you, let me make it really clear. I won't judge you. Okay? So you can always feel free, reach out, we can talk. and I won't judge you. I might call you out on your shit. I might challenge you to do something different. I might explain how much power you have to make different choices, but I'm not going to judge you because ultimately the way you live your life is up to you. And that's really can be a terrifying, but it's also a very empowering thing. So that's it. So please consider giving that gift to somebody else. We will see you next time. I love doing this podcast. Thank you for listening, and peace out, my friends.